All right, let's do it. Part number 2, Heidegger's Being and Time. Not the actual part 2 of Being and Time. It consists of 2 different parts. Anyway, uh, you don't care about that at the moment. I don't either. We are going to focus on finishing up what it means to be human, or at the very least, what it means to be that being for whom being is a question, namely Dasein. And we're going to move on then to talking about Dasein's being in the world, the actual world that Heidegger is referring to there, and finally talking about hammers. And let's see if we can crank this out in about 15 minutes. Sound good? All right, glad we're all on board. Okay, let's get going. So, Dasein's existence is a question for it, or a problem for it. But what is perhaps more influential than that formulation of what it means to be a being is the way that Heidegger characterizes the activity of Dasein, namely the way that Dasein is bound up by what matters. Dasein is not primarily a cognitive being, nor is Dasein primarily a physical being. Instead, Heidegger conceives of Dasein as that being that cares about things. And this is a really interesting, and I would argue profound philosophical claim to make, that he then attempts to back up by unpacking the experience of being in the world. He is trained as a phenomenologist, after all. Dasein is a being that cares about things. So what Heidegger is saying is that the core of who we are beings that care. We have things that matter to us, whether they're activities or other beings or places or states of mind. These things matter to us, and because they matter, they shape who we are and how we act. And so from here, all the rest really of the kind of being that we are spills out. Dasein is a being that has projects. Dasein sees possibilities that it wants to make into actualities, and so it engages in these projects, and it is concerned with these projects. So the overall project of Dasein is care, trying to have a meaningful existence, or at least understand the meaning of existence, and to also care for itself. And in doing so, it engages in a number of different projects connected to it. So these projects are not necessarily just, I'm going to build a shelf, or, I'm going to organize my spice rack. These projects are activities that matter to us. A project might be becoming a more empathetic person. And so in order to do that, you're going to engage in a number of different activities that will help you become a more empathetic person. Or maybe your project is that you want to learn how to bake sourdough. And so your project is going to involve you trying to learn how to bake sourdough. You're going to have to get all of the different parts that go into that project. You're going to have to get the ingredients. You're going to have to learn how to make a starter. You're going to have to understand the way that the particular climate in which you live has certain types of yeast and certain types of humidity that are going to affect both the flavor profile and also the rising times and shape of that sourdough. Sourdough is a fickle beast. If you were not aware, there are way easier breads to make. They're just as delicious. I do love sourdough. That's not a knock on sourdough. I'm just saying. You pay a lot of money for sourdough because it takes a lot to make a good sourdough. That brief aside, itself aside, the projects that we engage in are projects that are about realizing our possibilities. We are our possibilities, and the activity of trying to bring them into fruition. This is what Heidegger is trying to push as what it means to be the kind of being that we are. We are beings that care. We are beings for whom things matter. And so that becomes an interesting way of thinking about how we live in the world and what even the world means, because the world isn't just a collection of stuff then. And this is moving on to the second thing that I wanted to talk about with regard to Heidegger's being in time. The world. We are not living in a trash heap of existence, much as that might sound like the correct way to describe things. Instead, we are living in a world where we dwell. As unpleasant as the location in which we find ourselves might be, it is nonetheless the world in which we live. We are beings quite literally in the world, and that being in is an essential and fundamental part of what it means to be us. So, what is the place that we're in? Well, Heidegger, using this term, the world, goes full Heidegger on it, by which I mean he says that the world is that which shows itself in beings within the world. Neither science nor natural observation get at the phenomenon of world. World is already presupposed. Another way of thinking about it would be, when we are trying to describe experience, there is always a place in which that experience takes place. Whether it's within our own head and we're recounting our sort of inner mental life, our inner emotional life, that sort of a thing, or whether it's our engagement with other beings, be they, a cup or or another Dasein, trying to avoid calling them human beings, another Dasein, we're still engaged in a space, and that space is the world. The world is the backdrop of our being, of our acting in the world. The world is a fundamental part of Dasein's existence. And so to talk about the world as though it's just the earth is, in a sense, a mischaracterization, because what we encounter on the earth is nonetheless objects which are a part of our concerns, and those concerns play out in the world. So there's a sense in which the world and the earth are separate things. The world is, I would argue, what Merleau-Ponty might call my milieu, although he means it in a much more technical sense, and we can get into that later if you care to. For this video, I don't really care to get into that. But my point is, I keep moving past the mic. My apologies if there's audio weirdness. Which sounds like a sampler CD from Forefront Records in the 90s. There is your youth group kid referential joke of the day, or of the video, depending on what day it is. Who knows what day you're watching this. Anyway, the world, Heidegger says, is not a collection of things. The world is full of that which is closest to us insofar as it is useful to us. But unlike perception, I see the world as useful and interrelated rather than as parts upon parts. So what does Heidegger mean by this? Essentially, the world is the space in which I encounter that which is useful to me. Things matter because they matter to me, or they indirectly matter to me, as in this matters to something I care about or someone that I care about, therefore it matters to me. And so this sense of use is not instrumental. The sense of use is more connected to meaning. So something that is entirely unuseful but sentimental could be meaningful and therefore useful in that Heideggerian sense. The world is the place where we encounter those things that matter to us and where we work on the projects that matter to us. One way of putting it, I forget who said this. It was one of the commenters on Heidegger I was reading, said that I don't have a theory of my living room. I make use of it. And I think that that's really helpful. I don't have a theory of my dorm room or my bedroom or my den or wherever. I make use of that space. That space is meaningful to me, not because of the space itself, but because of what takes place there. And one of the things that takes place in these places are particular projects. So now we're going to talk about the hammer. I don't have a hammer in my office right now, but I'm going to briefly talk about this to talk about some terms that Heidegger uses with regard to the things we encounter in the world. So let's suppose that I'm building something, for an example. Let's suppose that I'm building a bookshelf. And when I'm building this bookshelf, I'm thinking about the different things that I need to put on it, or the things that I need to gather, the materials I need to gather, the tools I need to put it all together. And I need to cut boards in particular sizes. I need to measure. I need to hammer them all together. I need to make sure I get the right kind of nails, maybe drill some pilot holes, etc. Right? When I am doing all of this, I'm not thinking about the being of the tools or the being of the wood or the being of the nails. I'm thinking about how more or less useful these materials and tools are to accomplish this project. And so when the tools disappear during use, right? When I stop thinking about the tools themselves, Heidegger says that they are ready to hand. If I want to wake up, right? If I'm feeling tired and I want to wake up, I'm going to reach for a cup of coffee. And on my desk, you can't see it on the camera angle, but on my desk right here, I've got a mug. And so I can grab this mug, perhaps the most appropriate mug. This is Wissenschaft on it. And that is a German word for science or an organized body of knowledge, made by a lovely former student of mine, Gabby Hill. Thank you, Gabby. But when I reach for the mug, I'm not thinking about the mug itself. I am thinking about drinking coffee from it. Not that I would bang myself in the head drinking coffee. Anyway, the point being that the use of these tools, the meaning of them for the project, determines their meaning for me. That they matter to me. But let's say that I'm hammering away at this set of bookshelves and the hammer breaks. Suddenly the object becomes something that I'm aware of. It calls itself to my attention, having particular properties which may or may not have anything to do with the project I'm working on. Now, when something appears to me outside of its part in my projects, Heidegger calls this present at hand. It is made present to me. It's not a thing connected to my projects or possibilities. My everyday involvement with things already involves and implies a world, and my actions only make sense within a world. And this is where this present at hand, ready to hand really comes into the foreground, because when we're using things, and the tools that we use aren't necessarily just a hammer or a mug or something like that. It could be a rhetorical technique. It could be an institution. It could be a tool like the essay or the quiz or whatever. When these things break, the being of them becomes really apparent to us. And so this is something to think about. What tools, understood very broadly, have broken that you now see their being. Think about it.